There's this perpetual fear and anxiety that exists within each person every single day. And you're constantly reminded of what you've lost and what you still could potentially lose.
Hi, Arwa. Welcome to Press Club. Thanks so much for joining me.
No, thank you for having me.
So, you had a piece in CNN this week about your recent visit to Gaza, where your nonprofit is working with children affected by the war. What are you trying to do with these kinds of trips?
I mean, for me, it's more about like getting a real sense of what it feels like on the ground, and then sort of doing the kind of basic assessments to see where it is that we can plug ourselves into. We're a very, very small organism, but we're also niche in the sense of what we do. And we really do kind of try to look at everything and what other organizations are doing and then plug in areas where we sense that there are gaps. But of course, with Gaza, I mean, the gaps are everywhere. Everything is needed. So you just literally try to raise as much money as you can and then spend it, on anything from, distributing diapers to running mental health activities for the kids and whatnot. But I think it's really important. Obviously the work on the ground itself is being done by our Gazan staff, but I think it's really important for, others to also get in and get a really good sense of what it's genuinely like in there, because that allows us, from the humanitarian perspective, to be more adept and better capable to build real programs that are going to benefit the people, as opposed to trying to, dictate what should be happening from the outside, which we don't do.
Right. And I think it's very hard for the world to have an idea of what daily life is like in Gaza. And I imagine it's hard for you as well without actually going there. And part of the reason for that is because Israel bans foreign reporters from getting in. Could you tell us a little bit about what things are like in Gaza right now, what day-to-day life is like in Gaza right now?
There's this perpetual fear and anxiety that exists within each person every single day. And you're constantly reminded of what you've lost and what you still could potentially lose. I think so. I've been to, Iraq, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Libya, Syria, you name it. And there was something different about Gaza that, my colleagues and I were trying to put our finger on, and colleagues both like in the journalism space and in the humanitarian space. And I couldn't quite figure out what it was until I got there. And that's when I was really hit by it. It's the complete and total, sheer and utter psychological obliteration on a mass scale. You don't see life in the sense of life within a person, that spark of life that exists in, all of our eyes, that energy of life that, we all are supposed to be emitting. It's gone. It's gone. I mean, people's eyes are deadened, their movements are lethargic and mechanical, and you really do get an understanding of how it is that the deep intensity of the relentless daily trauma has forced everybody to have to shove all of their emotions down, because they can't risk any of it coming up. Because if it does, I mean, they will literally crack. Everyone's already on the edge of insanity.
Yeah, I want to drill down on that because, as you noted, you've covered war zones since the invasion of Iraq, and you went on to cover Syria, you covered Libya, Afghanistan. I closely followed your coverage of the Syrian civil war. I thought that was really vital. And what you write in your CNN piece is that the suffering you witnessed in Gaza is different from all of those conflicts. Now, the other wars were no picnic. Syria had Assad, he was an abject monster. You also had the rise of ISIS there and in Iraq. What about what's happening in Gaza right now makes it different in terms of its effect on the people there than those other wars?
I mean, yeah, and look, I mean, every war is horrible, and everyone who has suffered a loss in war feels a similar level of pain. Like, that's not necessarily kind of, the comparison that any of us really talk about, and the horror of having, to leave everything you love and behind. I mean, that also is the emotions that it generates is similar. But it's something about the relentlessness of the daily traumas being inflicted upon the people in Gaza with such frequency that makes the psychological effect really on sort of the very essence of what makes us human different when it comes to Gaza. It's the sheer constancy of it. It goes from, waking up hungry and having your children be hungry to the drones buzzing overhead that really feel as if they're taunting everybody with this refrain of, oh, you think you survived? Just wait. We're watching you. Your turn is coming. To the reality that there is no real, genuine, safe space there, that there's no access to anything that allows a person to feel like what they were before. Clean shower, proper bathroom, the ability to put your child into a bed, to just lean back against something when you're not living in a tent. I mean, everything has been so stripped away and eradicated, and then it's trauma upon trauma upon trauma. And you see all these instances where, if a child starts laughing, it all of a sudden gets cut off because either they've heard an explosion in the distance, or the drones are coming, or something else has sort of happened.
One statistic in your piece for CNN that really shocked me, and it's from 2022, so before the current war, and it found that 80% of children in Gaza reported feelings of sadness or depression, which is, I think, fairly staggering. And you said you're certain that those numbers that are 100% now. What do you think that means for the future of these kids, that is the feeling that is so pervasive throughout this region?
One, it basically means that, the health of the Gazan society, in the future, as these kids grow up to be adults, is in jeopardy. I was having this horribly morbid thought when I was in Gaza, actually. And it's a bit of an exaggeration, of course, but I had it. And it was that, Israel doesn't need to kill any more Gazans because they're basically already dead. Because I felt like I was walking through a sea of people whose souls had been so crushed that they were already dead. And I say that's an exaggeration, because even though that is the way, people are feeling right now, that's not to say that, that life cannot come back, right? That's not to say that they should, be somehow discarded. But going back to, the issue of mental health in children, if we look at it sort of more broadly speaking, if this sort of trauma does not get addressed, it effectively ends up, calcifying within an individual and will impede them from having a healthy sort of, productive life, and it will impede their ability to interact as they, grow and mature into adulthood. And this is where, as much as we talk about the need to physically rebuild Gaza, the need to provide prosthetics and, other sort of medical treatment for all of the children who have been injured, we also need to make sure that we don't lose focus on the need for mental health, because mental health still, to this day, always gets sort of relegated as a secondary, nice to deal with, as opposed to need to deal with kind of challenge. And that should not be the case. You cannot build a healthy society moving forward. We cannot talk about giving Gazans a chance to rebuild their life if we don't also give them the chance, the framework, and provide them with the resources they need to start to rebuild their psychology.
I think case in point of what you're saying there is this one child you wrote about, a 4-year-old named Ahmed. And I found his story really hard to read, but I think it illustrates what you're talking about there. So tell us about him and about your meeting with him.
Yeah, so I met Ahmed in a hospital in Egypt, and he was there with his grandfather, and he has half his head is shaved, and he has this like huge zigzaggy Frankenstein-esque scar on it, and his little hairs had just started growing back. He'd had a severe head wound. And Ahmed doesn't talk. Ahmed stopped talking. His grandfather was saying that, he used to talk, he gibberishy, whatever, a 3-4-year-old speaks. But then he stopped, and he stopped because he and his parents and his sister were actually fleeing to a shelter when a bomb landed near them, and they all died. And actually, Ahmed was presumed to have died as well. His grandfather didn't find him until I think it was like 10 days after the strike in a hospital, completely by coincidence. And so no one really knows, what Ahmed saw. No one knows if, he was knocked out right away. Did he hear his parents screaming? What were those 10 days in the hospital like for him? Because he doesn't talk. What you do see, though, is that, this can slowly start to get coaxed back with the right kind of, intense mental health work, because over the course of the weeks, he has started to interact a little bit more. So, he smiles at me when I come in. He gives me a high five. He'll nod and shake his head, but it really goes to show you, because he's not the first child I've met like that. Like a child who's so traumatized, they don't have words, they don't have vocabulary anymore. And that's something that requires, years and years and years of mental health work. And we have to be ready for that. We absolutely have to be ready for that. I actually also met, and this wasn't in the article, but I met a girl in that same hospital. She's about 15 years old, and she couldn't move. She basically couldn't really move from her chest down. So she was effectively paralyzed, except there was nothing physically wrong with her. And so the doctor's only conclusion is that it is some kind of trauma-related psychological paralysis. And now with physical therapy, she's getting a lot better. Now she can sit up, she can use her arms a lot more, but we're seeing this trauma manifesting itself in many, many different ways right now.
Part of that is why so many journalists have died in Gaza since the start of this war. The Committee to Protect Journalists says that nearly 100 journalists have been killed. Why do you think that this war has been so dangerous for reporters? Is it because of the nature of the bombardment on Gaza?
I think there's multiple reasons for that. It's also been the most dangerous war for humanitarian workers, and for children, if we look at it. On the one hand, it's the severity and the intensity of the bombing. On the other hand, the Committee to Protect Journalists and a number of other organizations have looked into a number of strikes that have killed journalists, and has basically concluded that it appears to be, a deliberate attempt to try to silence, the media. And yeah, this is the most dangerous, the most sort of egregious in some ways war that I think we've seen of our generation. And I never thought I would say that after having witnessed, the war in Iraq and the war in Syria and Afghanistan, especially.
This is an argument that I've heard made in America quite frequently. We often hear from defenders of the war in the U.S. that Israel is being held to a double standard, that it is carrying out a just war in a responsible way, and that other countries do not receive the same scrutiny for doing the same thing. And, one recent example of this was NYU professor Scott Galloway, who was on MSNBC, and he was referring to those killed in Afghanistan and Iraq by the United States. And he said,
"We weren't accused of genocide, but Jews are not allowed, and Israel is not allowed to prosecute a war. And they are prosecuting a war more humanely than we have done. The ratio of combatants to civilians is of civilian death to combatant mortality is lower than it was in Mosul, lower than it was in Japan, lower than it was in Germany. So there's just a different standard for Jews in Israel."
Now, to be clear, Scott Galloway is a marketing professor. He's not an expert on war, and I believe he's wrong on the ratio in Gaza being better than the ratio in Mosul. But either way, that's a belief about a double standard at play here that is fairly widespread in the United States. What do you make of it, this idea that there is a double standard for Israel and how it's conducting this war?
I think that's a bit ridiculous. I would counter that argument. And I mean, look, just to dial it back for a second, right? We, the press, should have put and had more scrutiny on, the U.S. for some of the strikes it carried out in Iraq and Afghanistan. The fact that, it wasn't is not because there's a double standard being applied to Israel. It's because the media didn't necessarily, do its job. And there is, and historically has been sort of this culture of we let people in power get away quite literally with murder. But to go back to, the whole civilian to combatant ratio, I mean, that's just a horrid way to do a calculus. And I do not think it's correct. I think if we want to look at comparisons of Gaza and Mosul, for example, and I'm not a marketing professor, I was actually a journalist who was on the ground in Mosul. I would say that Israel has killed 3 times as many civilians over the course of 7 months than the Mosul offensive did over the course of 18 months. And both of these wars were taking place in highly densely populated urban areas. The other key difference, I think, also in the way that Israel is carrying out its bombing campaign versus, say, the United States, for example, is this idea of, when do you carry out a strike on a target that you've been tracking, right? So we know that Israel tracks its targets, as does the U.S. The U.S., generally speaking, of course, this doesn't happen all the time, but the U.S. will, generally speaking, wait for a target to be in a less densely populated area before carrying out the strike, and or it will use a missile if it is in a very highly populated urban area that will only bring down the building that the targeted individual is in. The Israelis do the exact opposite of that. They track these targets until they get into their homes. And they use 1,000 to 2,000 pound bombs. And I think that's a big difference here that a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of or taking into consideration.
Now, speaking of the death toll, some have also questioned that because the Ministry of Health in Gaza is obviously part of the local government, ostensibly run by Hamas. So some people question whether or not that toll is reliable. Having been there and seen Gaza firsthand, what do you make of the claims that, and having covered previous conflicts with similar warfare, what do you make of those claims that that number might be inaccurate?
I mean, is that a possibility? Yes, of course. Inaccuracy is something that we deal with all the time, the fog of war, et cetera, et cetera. But we need to also look at, history where in the past, the same numbers provided by the same health ministry have, once the dust has settled, proven to be very accurate. And this is, something that the Israelis themselves use. Like they will end up using, or have at least in the past, ended up using the same numbers for civilian death tolls that the Ministry of Health had put out. So that's all I really would have to say, on that front.
Israel is preparing to invade Rafah, which the U.S. government is strenuously objecting to.
We've made clear our views about operations in Rafah that could potentially put more than 1 million innocent people at greater risk. During his call with Prime Minister Netanyahu, the president again made this clear.
But it looks like it's going to happen anyway. What do you think an invasion of Rafah means for Gaza and this war?
I mean, it's over, right? We're already seeing it now. There's been no humanitarian aid going through Rafah or Kerem Shalom for the last 48 hours. The UN is saying it's going to run out of fuel in the next few hours. I know that my charity, Nada, we've got stuff stuck on the Egyptian side of the Rafah border. It means that more people are going to die of bombs and disease and hunger. It's sort of, it takes up this suffering to a level that I can't quite wrap my mind around at this stage. And, the other issue also, if we're talking, more broadly about, Israel's military offensive into Gaza, something on this scale and this kind of an urban environment has to be planned out. If we look at sort of any other kind of similar battle space, of which there truly are none, but if we look at any that might even remotely, be similar, so that would be something like, Fallujah 2004 or Mosul 2016, there were always routes for civilians to be able to the battle space and actually hit an area where there were no bombs and where humanitarian access was 100% guaranteed. And that doesn't exist here. And that is really making, all the difference. This lack of preparation, this lack of sort of, adding a human component to this bombardment that really does seem designated to inflict punishment on the entire population. I mean, it is unnecessarily cruel. And, I could very easily argue that there are, a number of other military strategies that Israel could have, implemented that would have resulted in the same, end stated goal, the eradication of Hamas, without destroying the entire Gaza Strip.
Right, because that's an argument that you hear a lot from Israel and its supporters, that this was the only way to do this, and if you have a better idea, let's hear it. You're saying that in your experience covering these wars, that there are other ways to have gone about fighting back against Hamas for October 7th.
Of course there are. Of course there are. There is planning that can be put into place to allow humanitarian. Okay, so let's take a real-time example.
Right.
Let's say Israel wants to actually designate Mawasi as one of the safe zones. You then allow enough time for humanitarian organizations to be able to set that up as a safe zone, i.e. bring in the tents you need, bring in the portable toilets you need, establish warehouses closer to this particular area, put in whatever it is that one actually needs to be able to build that. Now, realistically speaking, this is just about impossible in an area like Mawasi because it's sand dunes, but you at the very least allow for, a basic framework to get put into place. Let's even take the scenario right now. You want to invade Rafah and you're going to tell people to go to Khan Yunis, which is all rubble right now. You know what? Hold off for a little bit, bring in a whole bunch of diggers, from Israel, clear a bunch of the rubble out, and at least create a little bit of space for tents. Allow aid organizations to shift their warehouses that are right now in the area where everyone has been told to evacuate from. No one really knows if any damage has been done to the aid warehouses, but allow that to get moved up to, an area like Khan Yunis as well. Allow for basic infrastructure to get put into place before you tell a population, get out of here right now or you're going to die. It's little things like this that can be done along the way. You don't necessarily need to drop a 1,000 to 2,000 pound bomb to get a guy in an apartment building. You
Right.
don't. We've all seen the Israelis use very, very precision missiles and just go into a specific apartment. And it's an impressive thing to watch, the way the missile literally just goes in and hits one apartment.
Right, which has not been the standard here. We've had 1,000 to 2,000 pound dumb bombs dropped on buildings. Now, I think domestically here in the States, there are a lot of parallels between the reception to the Iraq war and to Israel's war in Gaza, at least with these protests that we're seeing on college campuses. Do you, as someone who's covered both wars, do you see any parallels between those dynamics, either on the world stage or on the ground there, between the United States invasion of Iraq and Israel's attack on Gaza?
The dehumanization. I really thought we might have moved beyond that. It was actually what I saw, post 9/11, because I'm Syrian American. And so it was seeing the sort of dehumanization of Muslims and Arabs and how everyone all of a sudden got lumped into this, they're all the enemy sort of scenario and the rhetoric that was being used. I mean, that's quite literally what pushed me into journalism back then. And I just remember so quickly after October 7th having that same sort of sinking sensation of it's going to happen again. And it really seems as if no one learned the lessons of the post 9/11 world or where that kind of dragged us into. And that's not to say that, 9/11 wasn't horrible. Of course it was. Of course it was. Of course it merited a response. That's not to say October 7th wasn't horrible. It absolutely totally was. Of course it merited a response. But in both scenarios, we're literally allowing ourselves to be dragged down this cesspool of vitriol and hateful language and polarization and dehumanization and a complete and total, stunning lack of compassion. I mean, it's gutting to watch. It's gutting. And I remember I have that same feeling of like dread now as I did post 9/11.
You mentioned the start of your career as a war correspondent. I did want to ask about that because you had such an incredible journey. How did you get your start in that field?
Well, the short version of the story is I was in New York. I was working for a Turkish textile company, which is basically a fancy way of saying I sold bathrobes and towels.
Whereabouts in New York was that? Would I know this Turkish textile company?
I don't know. It was called, we had a website. It was called Bathrobes Online. Mind you, I know nothing about business or textiles, but we were like right next to the Empire State Building.
Got it. Okay.
So I was there when 9/11 happened, and that's what just pushed me to be like, I need to become a journalist and I need to start explaining people to each other. Because I am literally both of these worlds, right? Like I'm so deeply entrenched into my American and my Arab identity, and I've grown up that way my entire life. But then, of course, no one's going to hire the new girl who has zero experience. So I ended up getting an internship with like one small production house, and I made a bunch of contacts at the Iraqi Ministry of Information under Saddam Hussein, because I was translating for them on all their phone calls. And then they were like, oh, we'll give you a visa, which was kind of like, wow, that's like Willy Wonka's, golden ticket back then in the day. So then I found another outfit that had been trying to get visas to Iraq and convinced them to take me with them. So I did a few stints with them, and then CNN still wouldn't hire me. So then I ended up taking a gig with a Lebanese company that was selling toilets, like porta-johns and flak jackets to the US military. Kind of rocked up at CNN's door and was like, yeah, I've been emailing with you guys, but let's have a cup of coffee because I really want to work for you. That worked.
Wow. What was it like going over? Because you freelanced a while, right, before moving to CNN.
Yeah.
What was it like reporting from a war zone without a whole team or network behind you? I imagine that's a very daunting thing to take on and to undergo.
Well, I was freelancing, but I always had a team, right? Like you would go, so we were always at least a team of 3.
Okay, so you have like a cameraman, fixer, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Got it.
Well, I basically was the fixer producer. Mm-hmm. As the Arabic speaker initially, which was hilarious when I first went into Baghdad because the Iraqi accent is very different to the Syrian Arabic that I grew up on. So there was many a night when I would, run around the hotel being like, does anyone here translate Iraqi Arabic into Syrian Arabic for me? And like hoping that my correspondent didn't notice.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did, but you catch on pretty quick, and it all worked out. In the end. And then basically, so I started freelancing with CNN in 2004, but it was kind of like, we nicknamed that permalance. So like you're a permanent freelancer until I actually got officially hired in 2006.
Now we're in an era now where I think war reporting is increasingly seen as a luxury that even the major players are a little reluctant to pay for, which is, I think, something of a change, particularly, CNN, which still has a great international footprint, but the network made its name covering the Gulf War. But all these other places have restricted or at least limited their footprint internationally. What do you think about the future of war reporting? Are you optimistic that the media will still continue to make sure there are journalists in these places delivering reporting from the ground, or do you think that there's a big problem here with the media cutting back on its coverage?
I mean, I think there's a broader big problem with the media cutting back on coverage, generally speaking, war zone or no war zone, and kind of also on, to a certain degree, the quality of what's getting put out there. And I think, to take the conversation back to Gaza for a second, I think it's going to be quite interesting to see kind of, where things move forward in the journalism space and what happens now that other areas have seen what you can do when you control your own story, right? Because Gaza right now is the first time that Gazan's story is not being controlled by the Western media for the Western audience. They're able to tell their own story in their own words. And I think, media outlets are going to have to figure out a way to continue to incorporate sort of activist journalists in the way that it started, back in Syria's days, but now obviously has significantly been amplified with Gaza into the more mainstream, reporting styles that we tend to all have. And it would be quite interesting actually to see if there ends up being the sort of space for more training moving forward for people who are on the ground, local from there, as opposed to this kind of, parachute in journalism that we all do, myself included, to kind of ensure a continuation of the story. Because the problem that you face is not necessarily, the problem that you face is more that we allow the spotlight to move away too quickly, right? So, the media outlets send in their big guns, they do like the big splashy stuff, and then except the story's not over. And then the repercussions and the ripple out effects of whatever has happened don't get properly covered. And then you reach a point in time where it's like, well, how did this happen? I mean, case in point is ISIS, right? Everyone was taken by surprise that, ISIS emerged. Well, I mean, no, I'm sorry. The fact that the world was surprised by the emergence of ISIS is because we as journalists failed, or rather, I should say, a lot of our outlets failed, because those of us who were on the ground in Iraq and Syria at the time were screaming up and down that something bad was happening.
Now, my last question for you, because I want to let you go, but you retired from CNN. You left the network after a number of years there, covering a bunch of different things, and very exciting career there. What made you want to retire from reporting and pursue the nonprofit work that you're doing full time?
So here's the deal. The nonprofit work is all volunteer. So
got it.
Yeah. So I left CNN because I really kind of reached a point where I wanted to sort of try different forms of storytelling. And, there comes a point in your life where you can either stay with what is comfortable, or you can kind of go with where your gut is telling you to go. And I had this like ridiculous opportunity to shoot a documentary.
Right.
And it's called Seize the Summit. And the more I thought about it, I was sitting there and I was like, Arwa, you can either stay with what's comfortable, or you can kind of take this huge, massive, insane, crazy risk. And then I was like, I would rather take the risk, because I'm more scared of living with a what if and a regret than I am of taking a risk and failing. And yeah, so I kind of went for it.
Arwa Damon, thanks so much for coming on Press Club. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Great conversation.
Thank you for watching this episode of Press Club. Please subscribe to Mediaite for more episodes and for more coverage of media and politics. To listen to episodes of Press Club, you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.